part of what happens when you even utter the word racism is it's almost immediately like a barrier goes up in front of someone's face and their heart. When you say, oh my gosh, that felt a little racist to me, what they hear is, you're a fucking racist, right. You're a piece of shit.
Hello, welcome. I'm Ben Boyce, critical race theorist, drug legalization advocate, doctor of communication, and convicted criminal. And today's show is about wokeness as a religion. Why is it happening? Where is it coming from? And how can we avoid it? For the second time in the show's history, my wife, Dr. Erin Boyce, is going to sit down with me to record this episode. She also teaches college classes at a local Denver university, a different one than where I teach. And she too teaches using something called critical race theory. I have to say, it's really weird to live through a book-burning era, as critical race theory is literally being outlawed by people who are describing it as if they haven't bothered to read a summary, let alone a book. Ironically, Juneteenth was just declared a federal holiday last week, memorializing the historical fact that powerful white men kept slaves a full 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. That's how power works. And yet we might not be able to talk about that new holiday and why it's so important to know about it in many states without risking prosecution, all because of the threat that knowledge poses to current long-standing systems of power. You know, if I felt like my position was under attack by people who were trying to talk about things I did in the past and to make sure I don't do them again, well, that's my life as a felon. So I guess this argument is a bit different for me than for most people. I mean, I don't enjoy it, but I also recognize that even my crimes, which never involved any sort of violence and were not crimes against children, they still suggest that I might not be the right candidate for some jobs. Say I had just recently been released from prison and was already wanted on new charges, or if I needed to carry a gun for this job, which felons can never possess. The thing is, when I get refused for jobs or even volunteer positions because 20 years ago I stole a stereo and some other stuff, all to pay for drugs which I needed to avoid detox, I can't really get angry at the system for working the way it was designed to work. If I wanted to change it, or if the rest of society wanted to change it, because I'm pretty powerless in that regard, they could, but not without first understanding how the system works. Most folks have no idea what it's like to navigate the world with the stain of multiple felony convictions. Now, I have a lot of privileged identities which have allowed me to overcome some of that stigma, but not all of it. And it's impossible to ignore the fact that for every job I'm denied, someone else is hired. Someone who is a better bet, somebody who probably didn't have a felony record. I also can't be surprised if the person who got that job doesn't feel compelled to challenge the status quo, because the laws which blocked me are responsible for that person's success. As Vincent Sinclair once said about his political opponent's rejection of policies meant to alleviate poverty, it's hard to get someone to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding. That's how all systems of power are built, and for good reason. It's virtually unassailable when every cog, pulley, and belt has a personal stake in the continuation of things as they are. That's what hegemonic systems are, and that's why they're self-sustaining. I totally understand why so many people have a hard time talking about race, gender, identity, and especially the United States history of racial injustice, along with its obvious lasting legacy. I mean, the war on drugs would never have existed if not for U.S. racism. Our legacy of slavery and lynchings and Jim Crow and redlining and segregation never unwrote themselves. Those ideas were carried forward by the children of angry business owners and patrons who were forced to take down whites-only signs, but who were never offered opportunities to change their beliefs and their attitudes, which compelled them to put those signs up in the first place. These folks were pissed off. And just like generations of white people in this country who slowly saw their ability to abuse, enslave, and destroy non-white people abolished, they must have realized that this was a threat to their power, to their ability to monopolize business, to their better schools and neighborhoods. And if we started talking about it, they were sure to lose out. So they took their signs down and learned new ways of enforcing their attitudes and beliefs. Jokes, intimidation, using racist customers, stuff like that. That generation of kids whose parents were forced to stop practicing the Jim Crow they love so much, they raised people like me, who didn't realize until I was grown that racism still existed in any sort of systemic form. I didn't know that black men accounted for less than 7% of the entire U.S. population, but a full 34% of the prison population. I didn't know that laws had been written that never mention race, yet were used to destroy communities of color while seldom being enforced in white communities at all, like every original drug law in the early 1900s. And I also didn't know this racist practice of selective law enforcement continued well into my youth, with laws like the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 1984 and 1986, which made 5 grams of crack cocaine carry the same mandatory sentence as 500 grams of powder cocaine, 2 forms of the same drug, which both white and black folks use at similar rates. I didn't know that 80% of the time this law was used, this law which never mentions race, it was used to lock up a black man. I didn't know black children are more likely to be born into poverty than white children, up to 5 times more likely according to some studies. I had no idea that the median white family has 12 times the accumulated wealth of the median black family in the United States, or that more than 1 in 4 black households have 0 or negative net worth compared to just 1 in 10 white households. I could go on, but that's the point of today's episode. The going on is what gives ammo to the conservative commentators who have decided to label critical race theory and wokeness as the next big threat to their Christian values. We'll also talk about ways to avoid the trap of religious wokeness, why evidence is important, how the framework of faith-based spirituality is often appropriated by movements that are in no way religious. And we'll discuss our imaginary MAGA guy who sits in the back row of every class we've ever taught. We'll also talk about patriarchy, sin, patriotism, capitalism, and cancel culture. So without further ado, I give you my friend and life partner, Dr. Erin Boyce. Today we're going to talk about this idea of wokeness as a religion. This is actually something that's been picked up in the press by conservative reporters. There's quite a few articles even by that name, wokeness as a religion, wokeness, the new religion of the left. So we're talking on top of a lot of that today. I see this episode as a bit of a reappropriation of sorts, but I'm getting ahead of myself. For the second time ever, my partner, Dr. Erin Boyce, is here with me. She was on an episode a year ago called Methamphetamine. It's actually still the most listened to episode we'd had, so you are more famous than I am. Congratulations. Welcome back to the show, and today we're going to take on a topic that's a little bit outside of my normal discussions, but we're both teachers in the ivory tower, different schools. Between the two of us, we've taught at 3 colleges in the Denver greater metropolitan area, private and public, and we were finishing up our PhDs. You had just finished your PhD when Evergreen College happened. If you're listening and you're not familiar with Evergreen College and the wokeness scandal that erupted, that's a perfect example of what I want to try to differentiate today. This line between wokeness as a clear example of religious fanaticism that sort of run amok. And just because something like that happens, as we're going to talk about today, it doesn't mean that the movement, the ideology, the theory, the claim, the religion, it doesn't mean it necessarily it's not true. It just means that it is a religion. One of the things all religions have in common is they possess the power to compel people that follow them to do terrible things if they're not keeping themselves in check. So Erin, welcome to the show. I want to, before we get going, invite you to tell the listeners just a little bit about your religious background, what it has to do with what we're talking about. You listened to my episode last week called Religion as a Drug, and if you want to add anything to that, feel free to. But tell us a little bit about your experience with religion, your spiritual identity, and who you are.
Hi, thank you for having me. In thinking about my religious background, I was raised in a family who attended Assembly of God churches. So I was raised in the Assembly of God tradition, which was very what we deemed legalistic. So very strict around what are the rules, what are the laws, and how are we following those. And so that was very indoctrinated into me as a young person. One of my earliest memories of being in the church is going to church camp. Every summer, you would go to camp for a week and get with a lot of other people and play games and have church services at night. And it was great. It was wonderful. But my very first time there, and was never very much of a girly girl. So my church clothes were normally pants. But in the day when we're playing sports, you would want to wear shorts because it's hot out there, right? It's the Midwest. So I grew up in Missouri, part of the Bible Belt. That says more about me and my religious upbringing. But I remember the very first morning getting ready and getting dressed and my counselor coming to me and saying that my shorts were too short and that if boys could see my knees, I would get pregnant. These are the types of lessons that were taught to me as a young person. This very kind of shameful, being ashamed of my body, holding responsibility for other people's behavior, all of my young and adolescent life. So as a member of the church, my parents were very involved. So yeah, we were there Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, Bible studies during the week.
What kind of church?
It was Assembly of God. Pentecostal traditions. It's funny, I know you always joke with me about I like watching these ghost hunting shows, and even though I am an atheist and don't necessarily believe in ghosts and the paranormal and those types of things, I trying to understand why I enjoy watching those shows. My mom and I did that when I was a young person. We would dispel evil from people's homes, so we would go to their homes and walk around their house with our Bible and clean the house for them to rid it of evil spirits and the devil in their home and things like that. It was very, like I said, kind of ingrained in this very paranormal sense of religion, this kind of unseen fight between good and evil that was always going on. And that translated to a cognitive dissonance, I guess, in between kind of being a good person and what was deemed evil or sin that was going on in my own identity development, and wasn't allowed to really explore that, unfortunately. I wasn't until I was in my 30s, almost 40s, before I really was allowed, gave myself permission, not allowed, but gave myself permission to explore some of that identity development in a more integrated way.
You're hitting on one of the first things I discussed last week, actually, and I think what you're talking about is actually a lot more common than people that are hearing you and saying, what, you were sweeping people's houses for demons? One of the things I mentioned last week is that we're in this, what I call like a Burger King your way, right away version of religious capitalism. You're allowed to take what you want and still be allowed into religious organizations that once upon a time probably would have been a bit more strict on whether or not you're allowed to be there. And those religious organizations are fracturing and providing new alternatives like Scum of the Earth Church here in Denver, that is an organization that you would hardly recognize as Christian depending on where you come from. But built into all of these religions, from the Presbyterian, who we think of as traditional and doesn't think of a lot of supernatural things as really relevant, to the all-out Pentecostal that is praying and talking to a higher spirit as if there are demons overhead literally fighting and clashing swords for their soul and the ability to like tempt them and whisper things in their ear. We think there's this big gap between these two things, but I don't think that gap is as big as we think. If you believe anything slightly resembling what I just said, if you think that it's possible that after you die, your spirit and the essence of who you are sort of sticks around and can see even though it doesn't have eyes, and can hear even though it doesn't have eardrums, and the ability to have the same reverberations and the same electrical connections that would tell them in their brain what this noise they're hearing is. If you think those things, you're already in the same realm of evidence-free thinking that ultimately plays out in many of us. Mine was the same as yours, as you know. We at one point, because with religions also comes a state of exception. You're always allowed to do things that other people aren't allowed to do, but my goodness, it's for God. It's not because you. At one point, I was with my mom and a group of people at one of two strip clubs in Battle Creek, Michigan, after hours, and it was closed, and we went to anoint the place with oil. And the police showed up because someone called him. It wasn't open at the time, but I remember the cop let us off. He wasn't quite sure what was going on, but it was the same sort of thinking that I'd been told that sin. Sex workers are, anybody in that industry is sinning. Anybody that's going to that place is sinning. Of course, I learned better really early in life, but with that was this exception that we had to go be allowed to violate the law to take dominion in the name of Jesus over these things. That's faith. We're talking about something that there was no physical evidence whatsoever for, but based on a book and a group of people that had helped us believe it, we had constructed and supported and maintained this view of the world that, as you said, taught some of us, go cast out demons, get into that house and figure out what the spooky ghost in the corner is. and taught others, all that stuff's kind of weird, but Jesus was born of a virgin, he's the Son of God, and I have to accept that to get to heaven, and taught yet others that there's a list of gods that cover the Hindu origin of the universe and ways to get through dealing with spirituality. They're always the result of what we were taught and what stuck with us, and they're always we can talk a little bit briefly to remind listeners. Last week I outlined 3 basic ideas that all religions fit, and today what we're going to do is talk about how wokeness can become a religious identity and fit the same framework such that people use it as a religion, which means they also use it as a drug. What last week's episode was about was understanding that religion, in fact, works just like a drug. I identified religions by 3 very simple ideas. Number 1, it has to make a claim. It has to claim a monopoly on the truth about life, including things we don't yet know about, like the existence and identity of a creator of the universe, or what happens after we die, or what allows me to pray for God to bless me today or take away my tummy ache, whereas other people have really horrendous things happen. Number 2, religions require rules, where you were already getting into this with some of the rules involve gender performances, things that you would think would have absolutely nothing to do with the creator of the universe or a plan for salvation after we die. My God, you're not even going to have this body anymore, and yet built into it was you can't have shorts that go below your knees. And sometimes it turns into these fabrications and lies and systems of control. And then number 3, all religions also rely on faith, not evidence. And that doesn't mean you'll never find any claims whatsoever based on evidence. It means that if you're bringing evidence to the table to try to understand why somebody believes what they do about religion, you're in the wrong venue. I call it the tent of faith, the tent of religious faith. Religious people, no matter what religion it is, have some a huge tent, some a smaller tent, where they use a different standard of evidence to make sense of their world. When you notice that something feels good, but you, instead of sticking to the evidence, start to overspeak your argument, and your claims or your advice about how to fix a situation get more and more vague and harder to pin down, and you're not really saying anything but, my God, it sounds fabulous. Where you hear it most is in religion, and we were both Christians for 30 plus years. It's really easy for me to tap back into that identity and say things like, oh, God is so good. He's got a plan for our lives. My God has my back, and he stands with me against the evil forces of the enemy. The enemy is always walking about as a roaring lion, seeking to devour us, but luckily I can take the sword of the Spirit. And I'm saying nothing. There's nothing specific, nothing direct, nothing necessarily true, and certainly not evidence-based. But the more I move from saying God is something that I believe in and there's no evidence, to I have a sword and an army and he's got my back, oh, I feel so much better. Religions work so well because the faith aspect allows us to overspeak these arguments that feel really good. Now here's the trick, and this is where we can move into wokeness a little bit. There has to be some truth to the original claim, at the very least in the mind of the practitioner, because that truth feels so good that sometimes it gets taken whole cloth and applied to everything. And that's where things that are slightly religious or are spiritual move into this realm of religious identity. And that's what I think we're seeing happen to some degree with wokeness in different venues. We're seeing people learn that the author of the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, Francis Scott Key, has this story behind the second verse where he says, if you're a black slave in this country during the American Revolution and you joined Britain in exchange for your freedom if they won the war, you're not welcome back here unless you're dead. He wrote that in the second verse, the one we don't sing. And we don't know from our history classes that there's a story behind that of him being given like an honorary title as a leader of a platoon and getting captured by a group of escaped slaves. He had this disdain for black men in general who had escaped and turned on their owners, right? He hated that the fabric of white supremacy in the United States was being attacked. That's just one example of many things usually you don't learn this till you get to college or you read a book, and you say, what? Wow, that is hard to ignore. Why are we deliberately... You get kind of mad because there's some real truth there, and some people were really working hard to not let us know these things. So I think wokeness shows up as a religion when we take something true, like what I just said, and we realize there's some truth in a nugget there, and then we just start applying it to everything. And you hear a rock and roll song, and you just say that's racist too, without really being able to unpack. And where it's really gotten us in trouble is at our holiday dinner tables when we come home from college, our parents say X, Y, or Z, and we say, you can't say that, you bad person, you racist. And they say, what do you mean? And we don't know quite how to answer. We say, my college professor told me that. All this to sort of introduce how we're talking about wokeness today. We're both in the ivory tower, as partners, romantic partners, we've been married for 15 years. My God. I call them like the good kind of arguments. On a daily basis, sometimes we get up and over the 5 minutes of news we can stomach in the morning, we argue, we hash out positions, we try to make sure that we're both standing on solid ground because we've accepted that as humans, we're always tempted to believe that even when it's wrong. And unless you have someone you can trust saying, "Are you sure?" And we're both right smack in the middle of conversations happening around us in the ivory tower in college that are this wokeness sometimes getting out of control, and we're having to navigate in real time what that looks like. So anything you want to add to that expanded, and it went longer than I would have hoped, definition of what we mean by wokeness as a drug before we hop in?
The only thing that comes to mind, and that is the last point that you made, that we take things on faith. And interestingly enough, in some conversations we've had lately, thinking about how I think about my own progressive ideals, right? And I'm not a big fan of calling myself woke. I think that there's a lot of issues with that word, and thinking, that I finally arrived and I've got it all down pat is just, it's unreliable, particularly as a scientist, as a researcher, right? That our knowledge is always changing, and we always have to be open to new ways of seeing the world. And that's something that faith prevents in a lot of ways. Faith gets in the way, and if we say, oh, this goes against my religious teaching or my wokeness teaching, then I'm not going to entertain the idea. And I think that's where we get into real problems, because we don't open ourselves up to other ideas and have a willingness to hear something different and change, which is where real progress happens. When we start to believe we know it all, we get stagnant, and we think that we've arrived. We become the however many 60% of white Americans who think that we're in a post-racist world. We have to be able to interrogate the ideas that are presented. And I don't know, maybe this is where you were going to go in a little bit and I'm jumping ahead, but when we think about wokeness, I think about social media and clickbait. Yeah. Right? This idea that a lot of times I'll see a headline and will just get angry without even reading the article. The headline makes me angry. Right? And more times often than not, if I go in and actually read the article, I get more information, and then I can go and seek out other resources to educate myself about that. But we're not in a world where we do that. We're in a world where we see something, we get angry, and then we pass that knowledge on without being good stewards of it. Yeah. And that's part of what I see as an issue with what we're seeing, and knowing that I'm just as guilty, right? I've been just as guilty to see something posted on my social media and then have to backtrack because I let my emotion take over how I was really seeing what I was reading.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to do that nowadays. You and I, again, have talked about this a lot already, and I've mentioned it a little bit on the show, but I don't see Trump as attackable. We watched Bill Maher last weekend, and this was sort of what instigated this episode. He had yet another spiel where he just sort of ranted on Trump and all of these things that Trump stood for, and actually he had somebody in his panel who interrupted him and said, "You mean the 76 million voters who voted for Trump?" And he did this clever thing, which reminded me of what religious people do, where he moves away from the system and tries to just focus on an individual. And this isn't just religion, it's all hegemonic systems. They're systems that are built in such a way that they guarantee things will happen. But when those things happen, like when a man in a position of power is able to, from that position of power, to manipulate people to do what Harvey Weinstein did, for example, that's not something that only takes a monster. The system's built so that if that's something you want to do, or if you have an inclination, you can get away with it, and then later we're going to come punish you. But what we tend to do is blame the bad guy. And Bill Maher said, no, I'm mad at Trump, not the 76 million voters, ignoring the fact that Trump is a symptom, not the cause. People don't show up and run for president and get elected because they're demagogues that are that smart. They show up because there's a movement afoot. And in this case, we should have seen it coming. It was 8 years of a black man in office as we kind of patted ourselves on the back and felt woke. And there were people that resented not only that, but the awakening that happened in the meantime. This is where these dinners happen. I personally had it happen over and over in my family, where I would learn something in college mostly because we were reading things that challenged me that I didn't want to read outside of that. I'm so glad I've read them now. But as I learned those things, I honestly thought my family would want to know. And when I took those things back, much like you've experienced, they were like, I'm not having it, and they got annoyed. This is yet another symptom that wokeness is becoming a religion, because religions, I didn't list this last week, but they always know that other religions have it wrong, which means they have to view other religions as a threat depending on what they believe about the end of life, to like eternal torture and damnation versus eternal paradise. If you got the wrong religion in most Western religions, you're going to hell or to some place that's not the paradise you want to be in. There's no appeal. Religions exclude other religions. So the fact that now Liberty TV and a lot of the hardcore conservative base has started to openly rail against things like critical race theory, which we're going to talk about by name in a minute, and they're describing them as like these enemies. And in their descriptions, they're focusing in on only the worst parts. It would be as if I had a problem with a specific person who shot up an abortion clinic, and instead of describing this person as a terrorist, I picked out his Christian identity and said, this is what Christians are, knowing full well that most Christians would say, this guy kind of corrupted our image, right? What you're seeing conservative news media, and especially like hardcore conservative Christian, Kenneth Copeland type stuff, is just smear people like you and I, whose parents have never actually bothered to call us and say, hey, what's critical race theory? The few times we've tried to talk, they have no interest in hearing it from the people who teach it because they already know. Their trusted guide, their religious leader, who is using the 10 of faith, where we don't use evidence, we're in the 10 of faith, is including on the enemies list Islam, the devil, greed, idols that you put before God, and wokeness. And they're describing it as there's teachers in college teaching our students that we're all racist and that white folks are automatically bad and they need to just always feel bad about what they did. You have not heard a lick of critical race theory. You read like one line of a story somewhere and took it out of context. This is yet again religion. So there's two things I just packed in there to intro it. But yeah, I think both of those go together. Today we should try to do the same thing. Keep the systems perspective, not people, and recognize that this is a movement that's been long in the making. It wasn't just the shock of a black president. It was those semi on the line people that were like, well, I'm not racist, but people sometimes say I have some, problematic language, or I don't know, I don't want to hear it. Saw a black president and went, finally, we don't have to hear that shit anymore because we did it. And it turns out we doubled down. The black president allowed people to say, wait a sec, what's really going on here? And we all started to learn about Francis Scott Key and the millions of other things. And we brought those messages home. And when our parents and loved ones expected, racism is over, we got Obama, what they got instead was a doubling down. They're sick of it. Trump gave them a way to spit back at those people, specifically the media, because they've watched Modern Family and all these other television shows show up and promote what they've been told their whole life are sinful identities, sinful lifestyles, all the other code words. We already just moved into this a little bit. I feel like a good way to do this today, because this is another thing religious identities tend to do, incorporate, is this fogging, this blurring out of the boundaries when you go from the specific, what we all agree on as a definition of a word or an idea, to the ooey gooey, oh, that feels so good, Jesus is on our side. I thought it might be worth our time to unpack just a few specific words, and maybe a really good example is sin. We can all agree that sin is something that even if you're entirely secular, you can imagine in your mind an image of what sin would look like. Genocide, right? Hurting other people for your own enjoyment. It's got this really deep religious connotation, but we don't need that connotation to understand some human behaviors can be seen as like an awful sin against other humans. There's another context to that word that exits the field of evidence and enters the 10 of faith. And it says things like, sin is what we all do in life, but those who don't repent the right way or at the right time or to the right God are worthy of being tortured for certain things. And then those things begin to be listed, and we notice rule number 2 of what a religion is. It has rules included in it that you're scratching your head like, what has this to do with God? Why doth God care so much who it is that I fall in love with? This is bizarre since God created love. There's no reasons for these rules about shellfish or hoofed animals. You're supposed to take them with the rest. Thinking about how it can go from the specific nasty, these are things we can all agree we should work to get rid of, to vague. I have Christian people in both of our families that actually have gone a step further to say, when they use the word sin, what they mean is any failure to line up with the total will of God. A combination of which Bible verses you choose to follow and believe are still rules, like you're not hopefully following the ones about slavery or misogyny, along with a personal relationship that only you have and that no one else is ever allowed to assail because, my God, it's the creator of the universe. Whatever this dude's telling you. Now imagine how convenient that is if you've been right all along. If you've had this relationship with the guy forever and he's been telling you gay people are sinning for 50 years and you just know, man, what am I going to go back and question all those statements? How about racism?
Racism is one of those words that's really difficult because you get so many different voices that come into it. The way I've started to think about and teach racism is that it's almost like two sides of one coin, right? That you have this interpersonal behavior, which is what we all think about as racism, that I'm calling you a name, or I just, I'm walking around with a tiki torch, right? That's that kind of in your face. We know that you're a racist on an interpersonal level. Since that's in your face, it's hard to deny it is right there.
But evidence.
Right. That's so when you start to get into that, racism as a system is where I think people get bogged down and don't really understand. And it goes back to what you were saying a little bit ago, is it's not about the individual person being a bad person. It's about a system that employs tactics and strategies which then impact the lives of individuals and create a sense of inequality. And that's what I really see as the racism we are thinking about, teaching about, and talking about, particularly in our classrooms, is how the system of racism impacts individuals and that more kind of institutional piece of it. And that is, particularly when we think about critical race theory, is where it comes in that we all are complicit in that system. We do all play a part in that system.
Yeah, but we're right on the line right now, and this is my issue. Only at the last statement, the line of evidence. So those first two things are the same because they both fall in the field of evidence. Now, I agree with you that not most people anymore, more and more, we were out in the streets last summer, white folks, black folks, everybody was out for Black Lives Matter. More and more people are starting to grasp that those two sorts of racism are one and the same. The tiki torch is racist not because the guy holding it knows that it means something racist to those watching, but rather because there's a system that's already built that those behaviors reinforce, prop up. There's a gear called the Tiki Torch, KKK, intimidation, shame, stigma, black folks are inferior to white folks gear. And he's turning that gear. He didn't build it. Most of these guys marching in North Carolina were, 20 to 50 years old. They weren't old enough to have built white supremacy. They'd have to be 400 years old. They're turning a gear on a system that already exists. And if the system doesn't exist, this is why if there was a convention to march against crackers, it would not have the same cultural power because whatever gears these folks were trying to turn don't exist. There is a system in front of us that we see. CEOs, millionaires, presidents, rich folks, powerful folks, elected officials, pastors, across the board are disproportionately, not just today, they still are, but more importantly, for the majority of our history when the rules were made, where cultures were built, when they were shaped, when things were weeded out, when rules changed for different reasons. Most of those reasons came from white mouths, which simply means those folks didn't have to be racist to make a world that made their lives easy to live. The reason we have so many churches in our country is because so many Christians have always lived here, and they're not necessarily all religious bigots. They've all wanted to be able to find access to their religion very nearby, and so therefore, they've built systemic things right into culture to make it really easy to practice their religion. No problem until other identities start to suffer because of this. So when we say Tiki Torch is racist, that system that we're talking about is evidence-based. And as long as we're staying in the field of evidence, this is where the ranters act as if we're not. They act as if we show up to class and say, today we're going to talk about bad whitey. You white folks are evil because you were born white. Like, it's almost like they're putting their religious framework where we just show up and we take it all for granted before we start and we don't let any evidence assail this at all. In putting it on our behavior, but we start from evidence, from the prison industrial complex numbers, from the crack mandates in the Reagan era that were designed to give disproportionate sentences to people that had 5 grams of crack cocaine would get the equivalent mandatory 5 years in prison as 500 grams of powder cocaine. There's nothing racist in this law, and it turns out that black folks don't even smoke crack more than white folks. So it wasn't even racist in the sense that we can just go arrest. But what do you know? 80% of the people sentenced under those laws were black. That's the sort of systemic racism that is absolutely built on evidence. And if we're not, as a culture, taking the time to go, oh my God, 25 years went by as we locked up 80% black people. And do we want to live like that? Is that the system we want to proceed with? Hey, 30 years in, maybe we'll notice, oh shit, we really messed up. Let's fix that one. And then another 60 years goes by and we'll notice, oh, that new law we made. Or should we start to talk about systemic racism and that line we were right at? Make sure that we as teachers, especially in this era when people are recognizing, there's some truth to this, and some folks are starting to turn it into a religion, Draw the line. If you don't have evidence for the racism you're talking about, trust me, you don't need to fabricate right now. There is so much right in front of you. There's still studies that go on to this day where things as simple as sending in job applications without a face and using a black name versus a white name get you half as likely to get a call back from somebody. A black man with no felony record is less likely to get a call back for a job than me, a white man with a felony record, all things being equal. These are right now in our culture. That is what systemic racism is. It's not that the boss that's hiring somebody says, I feel uncomfortable, I'm not hiring the black man. It's not his uncomfort, it's that he's hiring somebody, and in that hiring process is power. You are giving access to money to a white guy instead of a black guy. We just crossed over from hateful bigotry to the world of power, and that power is evidence-based. You didn't cross that line, but I think the other side of that line is when people start to hear people like say things I just said, loaded with information and energy, to borrow an Audre Lorde term. That was packed. I'm not pulling those statistics out of my ass, but they take a long time to accumulate. And when you hear those things, along with the many other I could just pull out right now, the way Pat Downs and Terry Pats worked against specifically low-income black folks, the way the war on drugs has always worked to act as a doorway so that people, as a law enforcement officer, you just kind of want to go talk to see if you don't have any reason to talk to these dudes. But if drugs are illegal and they look intoxicated and you can pat them down and you notice a pipe in their pocket, as long as drugs are illegal, you've opened all these doors. When people hear these things we're saying, they go, and Francis Scott Key was racist? Holy shit. And instead of staying in their lane, they take a broad brush and they, at times, totally overspeak. And it only takes one thing for somebody that's like digging for that soundbite, one wrong fact to paste that and avoid all the other things we said in whatever conversation and be like, they just claimed that Ronald Reagan was a member of the KKK, right? We don't need to make claims like that, but some people get so gung-ho with this, they get like the spirit. It takes a hold of them.
There's a lot there, and I don't know that I can go back and unpack everything. I would say that, yes, I am in agreement with you that it is systems that exist that make all of this possible, even our interpersonal communication and interactions. But still recognizing part of what happens when you even utter the word racism is it's almost immediately like a barrier goes up in front of someone's face and their heart. When you say, oh my gosh, that felt a little racist to me, what they hear is, you're a fucking racist, you're a piece of shit. I won't say that's never the intention because I can't put my intentions on other people. But if I hear something and I say, that felt a little harmful, can we talk about it? My intention is not to say you're a horrible person. My intention is to say, that might be harmful. Can we think about how we can do it differently? And you are a product of your environment. Your belief or you're holding that ideal is a part of your environment. So you, again, progress by having some time to interrogate that and think, where did that come from? That goes back to the system's perspective, that you're not just a horrible person, you're part of a system, and let's think about how we change it. Where what we've seen recently, this uptick in particularly physical violence against Asian Americans, is that interpersonal, you're kind of a piece of shit, right? And that it's easy to say you're a racist. And so really being able to delineate between those two things, that are you a racist, which is really unlikely because most people I think don't want to be or don't strive to be racist, or are you part of a system that is racist and you're trying to figure out how to navigate that system with a more progressive and loving lens. And that's what I'd like to move people to. But again, when I try to challenge you on some of your ideals based in that system, that barrier goes up. And how do we break that down and make people realize? And really thinking back to critical race theory a little bit, when I'm teaching critical race theory, my purpose is not to get people stuck in their guilt and to feel like shit. Because when we get stuck in our guilt, we don't move. We don't progress. We don't move forward. Guilt and shame are debilitating. So my goal is not to make you think that because you're white, you're bad. My goal is for you to see a history of America that informs today. When I first started learning about this and thinking about wokeness, I definitely had a lot of guilt. Like, well, I just can't make any change. I can't do anything different because I'm just a cog in this wheel. How do I really make my own way as that cog? And I realized that was a lot of my guilt and my shame. And I had to move out of that. And so the goal is not to get people stuck there. And yet, as we teach this, there's this common dominant narrative through the media that that's the goal of this work, and
Right.
it's not.
Yeah, and I think that you asked a question that was probably rhetorical, but how do you get people to stay on board? In our ongoing discussions at home, we have a hypothetical MAGA hat wearing young white man. I don't know, he's like 6'3", sandy blonde hair. I don't know, 23 in my mind's eye, right? But he's in every class we've ever had because we always presume that in the back of the class is somebody that is so, we're basically drawing the caricature of somebody diametrically opposed to the things we're saying. And I'm with you. My goal is to reach that person. And this is, I think, part of what we're doing. When people smell wokeness as a religion, if they have any sort of religious identity and all, including atheism or agnosticism, they still smell out a religion and say, get the fuck out of here with that shit. What we're trying to do is say, we understand that since there's truth to this, anything that has a kernel of truth to it will likely be taken to an extreme by at least a small group of people who will over-apply it everywhere. You grew up in a family that had the stereotypical Greek put Windex on everything. In your family, it was silver nitrate. But we had it in our family, too. There were different, they were called glyconutrients, fix-all snake oil type cures that the companies were never allowed to say they cured anything, but they would tell you to take it for everything. You got cancer, take this drug. That is a normal part of being a human, is to find that something may have some benefits and to just over-apply it and go all in because it's easy. The simplest thing to be a human would be if you had one answer to everything. Your brain would love you. And that's what religion really is when it's working right, is you just always turn to God. It infuriates those of us on the outside doing our work because we're questioning all of our, taken for granted norms and we're doing this work. But I think the more we can tell people this isn't a religion, and if other people are saying things they can't back up or there's not statistics or they're using that shame thing that's part of religion, which is to say you're a part of the outside group, which means you're not in, those are religious ideals. When I'm talking about racism and systemic racism, I'm talking about things that are right in front of us. And to live in a country that nobody argues was built on slavery initially, and to not be willing to have that talk, even if it's 1,000 years out, there's something built in that you just nailed, which is that part of our cultural identity. We don't have an identity. If you ask somebody what their culture is, especially if they're a white person, their American culture, they're likely to be like, well, I got my 23andMe back and it's German, or they struggle to know what that even is because part of our culture is to never recognize the culture. We call it a melting pot when it clearly, there's no such thing as an all restaurant. You go to a Mexican restaurant, you go to an American restaurant, or you go to a Chinese restaurant. Same thing with bars and clubs and groups. They're always identified and spread apart, but we don't want to talk about that because we're post-race, and we have been for, I guess, since the day after slavery was supposedly abolished with the 13th. So to answer your rhetorical question, I think this is the work that does that, is to tell people we understand that there are people that are going to misuse the idea. All we're trying to do is to give the people that don't want to talk about this a pathway to eventually not, it might be their kids or their grandkids before we get it right. But if you don't want to talk about it, let's just get to post-race.
Well, and that idea of being post-racial, I mean, I think about even my childhood, and I don't know if you've shared with your listeners, but our daughter is biracial. Having these ideals of, I'm raising a Black child, so I can't be racist and I don't need to explore that part of my identity. And that was a lie that I told myself, right? And it goes back to that idea of being colorblind and how easily I was able to adopt that identity, right? Not to, I guess, to borrow from Martin Luther King Jr., I was very about the content of someone's character and not the color of their skin, right? And thinking how woke this made me. And that goes back to that idea of religion, of believing without interrogation, right? That I could take this identity and put it on myself and say, oh, I'm woke, right? Like, I've got it. I've got all the answers. I don't need to grow anymore because I don't see skin color. And if I would have held to that as within the tent of faith, as you've talked about, when someone came to me and said, you know what, that's actually problematic, I couldn't hear them because this is what made me a good person. But because I was able to step out of that tent of faith, and maybe part of it is my research background and that evidence matters to me, and someone could tell me a story, could give me an example, could show me how that actually could be harmful to someone. And even though if we want to say race is a social construction, of course it is, but it's still real, right? When I look at you, Your skin is one of the first things I see, so it is something that I'm going to identify you as.
Yeah.
And so
we can
to
go a step
pretend
further.
like we're blind to that, or we don't see color, is a fallacy that we tell ourselves to feel good. And so how do we convince people that it's okay to interrogate our ideas and to use evidence? Because that's the big problem. Is even if it's right in front of our face and we know it to be true, we have a hard time believing it. And that goes back to, we were talking about yesterday, cognitive ease. Our brain likes to put puzzles together, but the less energy it can expend, that's what it wants to do. And if something gets in there and starts to jumble it up, it's going to fight back a little bit. And you have to fight through that, right? And think about how do I use mindfulness? How do I use the tools that I have to really think about what I'm thinking and decide if this is really who I am and what I believe?
Yeah. And just to add to that, a little bit of more evidence for, I mean, it was there. Of course, our skin's different color and we see that, but it's easy for people to jump away from that and say, not me, just because you're racist, I'm not. If that's where you're at and you're thinking like, well, where's the evidence? I would point to the laws in Virginia, the laws in South Carolina. Ronald Takaki is a good resource for this. That's where whiteness was invented. It didn't exist before that. So we were content to just hate people because they practiced a different religion, but slave owners realized really early on that if they didn't figure out a way to keep those folks fighting against themselves, that they were going to be outnumbered, and they simply gave rights to white folks by white skin, including the right to be able to read, the right to own property, the right to ever be freed. All of these things, including white folks were given the right to kill black folks without repercussions in many states. When people say, well, where's the evidence? That's where I would point, is to say, I get it, it's been a long time, but given what these laws said, I think that the burden is probably honest to just make sure that any remnant of that is completely absolved. And if somebody's saying it might still be there, you saying it isn't might be part of the problem, because as long as we're staying in the realm of evidence, let's go all in. Give it to me. I'm willing to listen, and I'm with you. You get a taste for it, like changing your mind about things that you really almost considered holy and realizing, oh, I was wrong. Because the alternative is that you're still wrong. 10 more years goes by and you're 10 more years in ass. All right, let's do a couple more, because I think this is a good way to differentiate as people are thinking, how do you know what is like religious thinking and what's normal? We've done it with the word sin now. We can agree that there's things we all agree, and then there's this vague non-evidence area. Racism, we can agree there's a lot of statistics, but there's also people that say capitalism, it was designed to be an inherently racist system, and they may not have like statistics to back it up. We need not overspeak our case. There's plenty to prove systemic racism true. How about patriarchy? Because this is huge right now, especially since patriarchy as a word is literally built into many religions in such a way that, much like capitalism, when you point out some of the errors, people tend to automatically hear, fuck patriarchy. Now, I tend to feel that way. I can't see a whole lot of good that I get why it existed. 10,000 years ago, it may have been somewhat productive, probably why it evolved, but every bit of uneven ground has been relatively resolved with like hydraulics and pistols and cars and like all the things that now women are not disadvantaged in any sort of way that we need to maintain a system whereby men are just naturally given superior status. So when people talk like I just talked, I'm on the verge of moving into that religious area. How do you see patriarchy as evidence-based? How do you see patriarchy as when somebody goes too far and you almost have to say, okay, well, time out, we're kind of overspeaking?
Patriarchy is so interesting, I think, from an evidence-based perspective, because it's one of those systems of power that functions so well invisibly. And I do.
What's the president board look like? Or do we just learn not to see it? Who's always driving? What most of my teachers look like? Who always got to say the final say?
You're right. Those do seem like the very evident and evidence-based that we do see that, right? That we know when we look at the gender wage gap. It is real, and that women, particularly,
although that's tricky too,
and particularly women of color, are paid less than.
It can become invisible, though. There you have a really good point, that if you're not running those data the right way, you can make it look as if the only gaps in the pay wage between men and women are those that women want because they don't take as many jobs as men. That's not the case. When you do the comparisons right for the exact same jobs, you realize, aside from outliers that occasionally a company promotes a woman and gives her $10 trillion to make it look better. Right. You take those out and it's I think we're at 82 cents to the dollar right now for men.
Around that. And I mean, and I even think about my own field, social work, right? Yeah. Where it is almost always defined as and identified as a female-dominated profession. And a lot of that goes to patriarchy in that women are carers. They're the ones that provide care and love to people. And so they're more suited for this kind of work. And you see that run through all of our systems in social work, that men hold more dean positions in schools of social work. Men hold more CEO and higher level positions in social work. And so they are pushed through the ranks much quicker than women are. Even in the same jobs, the gender wage gap exists in social work the same way it does across other populations and other work. And so those are, again, the way that even in a system that totes itself as social justice and, we're going to change the world, that we ingrain these systems within our own and we create inequity and discrimination through the adherence to these kind of invisible ideals that we have about men and women's capabilities. But I think even more when I think about patriarchy working invisibly, and here I'm talking about more of a more interpersonal level, I guess. But I mean, thinking about our lives, right? And that I think as a family and as partners, you do a really good job of keeping me in check when that shows up. And hopefully I do a good job of keeping you in check when it shows up. But that we have been given these, particularly from our religious identity and religious upbringing, these beliefs about how a relationship is intended to work. And I think about the pushback we got from our families when I was the one working and you were staying home doing schooling with the kids and taking care of them. My mom was always, well, when's he going to get a job? And I'm like, he doesn't need to get a job. He's staying home and taking care of the kids, and I'm working. Like, at that point in our lives, it worked for us, but other people outside of our lives couldn't see how it could possibly work. And they saw you as less of a man and not taking care of your family, as if I was being forced into the world to work. And the thing is no, it's what worked for us. And we got a lot of pushback from our families. And I think that we've just kind of seen that in our own even experiences. I know that we do very gendered activities in our home, right? In some ways. And things like, so it exists in so many ways. And it's just one of those systems that's really hard to break free of. I think we can break it down really easily, but changing those behaviors gets really hard. Most of the times when we go somewhere, you get the keys and you drive. But I also wonder, I'm like, is that really patriarchy, or is that just works for us in our partnership? And how do you begin to tell the difference between those two things? You know what I mean? Like, and I think we were talking about this the other day with gender. I told you I had read an article, and now I feel bad because I don't have the article or the authors, but it was an article about women leaving the workforce and how differently they perceived it if they made a choice to leave the workforce or if they were pushed out of the workforce. And yet not recognizing that making the choice to leave was often because there was a pressure to leave because of becoming a mother. And yet these women who chose to leave the workforce felt empowered by that decision, and not recognizing that they're probably, I can go back to, I left a job not too long ago within the last 5 years or so because I had a boss who was incredibly inappropriate, made me very uncomfortable. I treated women very badly, and there was a lot going on, and there were a group of women who got together and went to leadership and said, hey, this is not okay. And the response was, we're not really going to do anything about this. And they didn't really take any steps to protect us or to make us feel like there was going to be some accountability for the behavior. And I made a choice to leave that job, right? And I felt empowered by the ability to make that choice, that I could make that choice and I could leave. But the truth is I love my job. I loved working there. And I was literally pushed out by patriarchy. And yet I didn't necessarily see it as being pushed out because I felt empowered by the ability to make a choice. So I don't know if that makes any sense or even fits with what we're talking about, but there's
it's a good story. I think it borders on the religious side of it, which is to say, when we tell stories like that, I'm with you. I was there. So yeah, I know exactly what you mean. What you're saying is, the more we break this down, the closer we would get to the statistical evidence that's unavoidable, which is, what do you mean he was acting poorly? And we could say things like he would corner women and he would sort of sit on their desk with his leg kind of hanging all wide open over their workspace as they were sitting down. These are just two examples of things this guy was doing. In his mind, my guess is he had no idea. He thought that, not only was he entitled to do that, but he had also had it minimized how intrusive it is in a culture like we live in to just invade the space of women. And had the whole thing been switched, chances are, if it was a woman acting that way and a man sitting down, the way our culture is still set up, it would have felt different. It would have been, imagine you're a viewer on television watching it. It would have felt different to watch that interaction on whatever show you're watching. These are the things where the more we break it down, the more we could say, okay, well then, why is it that's a power dynamic? And again, we're going back to where I started, which is it's not unless, let's just pull out a list of CEOs and let's not be those dicks who start in like 2021, because we'll still find actually a very big disparity. But the 81 or 2 cents an hour that women get for men across the board now, it was like 50 cents if you go back 50 years, right? If this is something that's been ongoing, we can all agree that the power that is enacted over 50 years is going to do a whole lot more damage than the power that's enacted for 1 year and then corrected. The disparity is ongoing. So the reason these things, not only do we live in a patriarchal culture to boot, women couldn't vote, right? The construction of women as always being less than, as being there for only for the support and encouragement of men. The statistics are there, and we can, as long as we can point to people, why is this a problem, which we're doing right now, it leads to situations where men intimidate women into quitting jobs without even realizing it. And then when they're called out on it, they're like, how dare you? And the women end up quitting, right? Just one example of many. Most, 90%, I think, of sexual assaults are men against women.
Probably a little higher than that, actually.
Yeah. Heterosexual partner violence is almost exclusively arrested the same way. This is what patriarchy looks like playing out. That's the reason that people like us are like, we should get away from it. But when we talk about it, the statistical side is pull out your president board. You can see that just like with Christians wanting churches everywhere, not because they're assholes, but because they want to be able to practice their religion, white men in charge made rules that made it really easy to be a white man. And even the most woke white man in the world would still disproportionately, especially years ago in that environment, make rules that made it harder for people that weren't like him. So that one was tricky. How about patriotism? Is there anything on the evidence side? This might be an interesting one in that when you try to think of like, what the hell is patriotism? I don't think there's anything that you could put on a list that everyone would agree on.
Interestingly, if you would have asked me this question 10 years ago, I think I would have had a really succinct answer to it. But today, I don't know. Do I consider myself a patriot? I don't know because of the connotation of the word, but do I love my country? I think so.
Can we differentiate the real from the religious? Is the experiment.
And this may be a pipe dream, it may be just what I need to maintain my hope, but I do think I believe in the promise this country can be.
That's the right answer. I mean,
it is the right answer, and that's probably what you're talking about right now in religion, that I'm giving an answer that has no substance, and I recognize that. I'm not.
Well, if we went to evidence,
seeing it.
You would run short, I think. If right now we said, let's make a list of things you love compared to other places, we would probably both go, oh shit, what I mean by love is religious tent love. It is a different definition. If I ever lived with a partner that treated me like this country treats me or has treated me, no, I don't think so. No, this country does great things for me too. It's made this podcast possible. It's given me a PhD. But it doesn't mean that if you're in an abusive relationship, just because the person is rock ass in some other ways, right? It doesn't mean you just stick around. I think patriotism may only, you nailed it, it might not have anything but a religious connotation left. When you mention that word, you are always swerving into what we just did, which is to say, first of all, we know that the right answer is you love this country because you're getting hate mail if you say anything else. So I too love this country. It's one of the few that would have given me a chance to rebound after my felony convictions, but it's also one of the few that would have given me the damn felony convictions in the first place. So it's really hard to just ignore the first part and do the second, but that's what our culture is. You're always supposed to ignore the first part and only say, God bless this country, and never dive into well, are you sure there aren't things we should still be working on? You just reframed everything if you're saying we still have work to do. It's almost like our culture is built to always be woke and done and perfect.
And there is that caveat. Again, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, I would have been full in. No, America's the greatest country in the world. 10 years ago, probably had some, I don't know that I would have called myself an atheist 10 years ago.
Those two things are related.
They are. And in thinking education, right? The evidence base. As soon as I started allowing evidence into my purview, I was able to say then, oh, I'm a little disillusioned with America. There's all of these things, these stories, these narratives that I've been given my entire life from my family, from my church, from my school about who and what America is. And I believed that lie, right? That this is what America is. I believed it was true. And again, recognizing that's also from my place of privilege as a white person, right? That a lot of those opportunities that were talked about were available to me. But in learning and engaging the evidence base, I've definitely come to realize that America is not what I thought it was, that what I had been taught was not the full truth of who we are. Maybe I should say that. I mean, I do think I was given information that's based in reality, but I think there was a lot left out, right? Which is what we've been talking about it now. Do you get slavery? Yeah, but I get one chapter on slavery, and it was very that really it was a good system because, not necessarily the horrors of that. Yeah. Did I know about Native American genocide? And not till I was in college. The only information I got about indigenous cultures was sitting down to our Thanksgiving dinner when we all got to dress up as pilgrims and natives and sit around and eat meals and talk about how much we loved each other. Like, the truth of this country was not given to me. And it wasn't at my fingertips like it is today. Right. When I was in high school, we had 4 computers in my high school, and they were all in the library, and you could go play the Oregon Trail, or Carmen Sandiego. You really weren't able to Google search and get on the internet and find information as readily as you can today. And not to say even if I could that I would have went and researched those things back then. I can't say that I would, but I've been given knowledge now that says I need to rethink how I see this country. When I think about, we've talked about it, and I see it so often just in social media and even for my students, well, I'm just going to go to another country, right? Canada, you have healthcare and like all of these things. And the truth is I could talk about it, but I don't think I'd ever want to leave here. I do appreciate my life. I do appreciate what I have. And I do think we can be better as human beings. And I need to hold on to that. So in my mind, that is very more religious based and not evidence based. But I think that's my sense of patriotism. If I would say, what does patriotism mean for me today? It means loving your country enough to make the sacrifices for it to be a better world.
Not a lick of evidence. There's
no evidence. There's no
room for evidence in it, right?
But there's not. Yeah, but it is what I hold that helps me to get out of bed every day.
This is how we can know it's fully religious. Very few of the things I've asked did your brain just keep jerking you back in off of the question I'm asking, which is how do we differentiate between where patriotism or sin or racism or patriarchy are legitimate concepts that we can talk about with evidence base and where somebody is deploying these same ideas in a religious context. In this one, there is no evidence base because, like you just summed up, I would say my patriotism is, well, that's how everybody starts that phrase nowadays. And as you were talking about it, just like all religions, you don't talk about the stuff of it and defend it. You start from a premise of I take it 100% and it's the truth, which means you're always naturally on a defensive. Second, anybody says, oh, you believe Jesus was born from a virgin? You are about to explode. And no, you can't explain how it happened, and how dare you? Those things aren't offensive questions. They turn into really deep, beautiful conversations once you wade in. But most religious people realize there's danger afoot. If you've convinced somebody to believe things that some of which are shifty, some of us realize later on that a few of those lies are enough that we question all of it and we throw it out. And if this is a system of power, which it is, the last thing you want is for people to wake up and go take off running. All right, so patriotism, religious term. How about, let's do it. We sort of skipped this one. Critical race theory. Which side do you want to start with? The real, the legitimate theory? We did this a little bit. You waded in. I should have brought it up at the time. But how do you teach critical race theory?
I think like we've talked about, I come at it from a systems perspective. And then using critical race theory to go back to the facts like we've talked about. I know, very controversial, but I use the 1619 Project and slave narratives.
Why is that controversial?
I'm saying there's, in the large media right now, there's controversy around the 1619 Project, right? The Texas bill that just got passed, I think, is called the 1836 Project, which is clearly a direct pushback, right?
Yeah, that's our culture, though.
Trump's was the 1776 Project or something like that,
that's
right?
That's our culture. That's not unusual.
It is our culture.
Sorry.
I use controversy in the terms of the larger, broader society, not necessarily within kind of our circle and what we do. more from a systems perspective and providing evidence, right? So we'll look at stories and look at redlining and the impacts of redlining, and then bringing in, which more people are talking about now, which I will admit Tulsa I was not very aware of until it started showing up in the last year, but Philadelphia we've talked about, the bombing in 1985 and some other issues like that. So trying to bring,
The MOVE organization was the Philadelphia one.
Really, again, trying to come at it from a perspective of systems, and that we're all a part of these systems, and that it requires us to take a step back out of it. And
this feels really good.
You don't think it's evidence-based, what I'm talking
about?
Not
yet. It might get there. You're starting on the gooey edge. You're not in the religious world, but you're right on the line. This is something that we actually, it's been really helpful for me, and I hope, fingers crossed, for you as well, because we tend to teach on different sides from different perspectives, reasonably so. I'm like a prisoner who spent time in prison, addicted to drugs for a long time. My perspective is more rooted in that, and I have a communication degree, and I teach communication classes. But yeah, I feel like you're saying all the nice, fun stuff that sometimes you get to end the paper with, or the paragraph if you really do it right. And man, it feels good to read it, but you haven't said anything yet. So we've just switched it we have to teach from a systems perspective and teach that the system has things built in, right? The things have to be identified. And those are the sentences I've just sort of taught myself to end on, because otherwise the MAGA guy just said, here we go again. This woke-ass liberal teacher's coming in here spewing this religious-sounding, obscene crap about what I heard on Fox News last night. She's saying I'm a racist because I'm white. You're not there yet, but yeah, I feel like you're right on that edge. Where does it jump over to back up all the stuff you're saying with stats, so the MAGA guy has to go, oh shit, I'm back?
Pack for me then, because I thought that's where I started in saying we're going to look at the impacts of slavery, and we're going to look at real narratives around that. We're going to look at black codes and Jim Crow laws and redlining, and we're going to look, right? We're going to look at Native American schools and the impacts and the horrors that happen there. So one of the ones that I go to most often, particularly around critical race theory, is child welfare. My background is very much in child welfare, and there was so much outrage in the last couple of years, and particularly in my classrooms, around child or family separation at the border. Yeah. And, so many people, this is not who America is. This is not, and so this almost goes back to the patriotism conversation, because my argument is, no, this is exactly who America is, right? So from indigenous communities in the schools, they were tearing people's families apart, and they were destroying their culture. In the slave trade, this is what chattel slavery said.
Religious.
This is not, this is fact-based.
I understand.
That chattel slavery was a real thing. The indigenous schools were real things that happened that demonstrate how America has never had a problem separating families. From the moment that white men stepped on this land, there was a policy of family separation that occurred that's followed us for the last 400 years, and that's based on policy decisions. So I guess unpack for me how that feels religious and not fact-based.
You just stitched it in. It's not that. I mean, I believe most likely Jesus of Nazareth was a person that existed. So if somebody telling a story about how Jesus was in a certain area that he may well have been in Galilee around that period of history relies on saying, well, this is just a fact, this is evidence, it might not have anything to do with what we're talking about. And what critical race haters are saying is, like, you get into the class and the first thing the teacher says isn't, you live in a great country. You live in a country that's made slow but steady progress. You live in a country that gives more money, these things are all true, by the way, gives more money in aid to other countries for all sorts of stuff, for medicine, for food, for a lot of it for like religious crap, especially private donations to missionaries. But these are things that are also true about this country. The critical race haters are saying, you don't get any of that. Where the teacher starts is exactly where you just started. They give you a long list of atrocities, almost all of which are hundreds of years old, and then you added the stitch at the last minute, which is what I think is vital. What you're saying with these examples isn't, all right, so have a good day, which is what they seem to be suggesting on Kenneth Copeland and Tucker. The stitch to say, the reason I am bringing this up is to say, the United States culture is nothing if not enforced silence on really important issues so that we can all go, oh, and act surprised when things happen that we should have seen coming all along. That's what we do here. We always build it that way. So that means that when you see we're separating kids at the border, it's yet another example of where you have a choice and you either have to go, oh shit, we've put that work off for so long that, yeah, we knew this would happen and it's our fault. Or you have to go, this is the United States. How could this happen here? And you get indignant and you huff and puff and you blow your energy on worthless endeavors that don't change anything. And then lo and behold, a year and a half goes by, a new president gets there and you hear they're separating kids, they're putting kids in cages again. Oh, what is going on? I'm surprised. I can't believe this. That stitch that you put in, I mean, it was minimal in your case, but at least it was there, which is to say, I'm not just giving you a list of racial massacres because I think you forgot. Yeah, it's possible nowadays to go learn these things yourself. I'm, as a teacher, making a connection to a historical past that if you don't pay attention, it'll be 100 years and our great grandkids are going to be having these same talks after another Dylan Roof goes in and shoots up a church, thinking God's told him to do that and that his white congregation, under the calling of God, wants him to murder black folks. That's where we're at right now. So when I say evidence-based, I mean, maybe that's a little off. It's not that those things aren't true. It's that without that stitch, like you're sewing together the reason for mentioning all this stuff. But critical race theory to me is exactly what you said, except I start at the other end and say, what is it that's going on that when a black kid is born, a baby is born in this country and a white baby is born in this country, that the chances of the black kid being born into poverty are multiple times what it is with the white kid before a day of their life passes, especially if you're a religious person that thinks like God knits together the hairs on your head and all that. You ought to really be paying attention if you're living in a culture where whatever system, not people, system is set up is like the day somebody's born. Oops, they're in a hole. That is a systems problem that starts way before kids are born. And the more we can focus on that and say we ought to be critical of a system that says if you have red hair, you're 10 times more likely to be born poor. If you are somebody whose family is generally under 6 foot tall, you're 20 times more likely to be poor. We ought to be saying, oh, we got to be critical of that. Now, it turns out we're talking about race. So there's the race, critical race theory. It undergirds everything because it turns out that the closer you look at stuff, you would almost think this country was built on race-based slavery, the way it seems to have sort of bled into everything. It would almost even, to go a step further, you would almost think that at some point it went away, but the work in the reparations and the deliberate attempt to not take down the no-colored signs, but to do the work in our heads and hearts, it never happened. And instead what happened is people that didn't want to take those signs down and had kids with good ears who were paying close attention were forced by the man to take these signs down. They put them in their back fences and they got to work talking and teaching a generation that is not that old to feel a certain way. And many of those people have not done the work to realize they were taught shit.
Those pains are given to our children. No matter how hard we try not to or try to do our best, the pain that we experience in our lives gets passed on to our children. And thinking about how are we raising our kids and what does that look like?
No,
parenting seems like such an important part of this.
You're making a good connection. You've done it twice now. We're in such a pre-programmed state of religious frameworks in our country that when it comes to presenting an idea to somebody that is full of holes and full of obvious verses or sections like our history books that you have to deliberately ignore that are still playing out today in ways that you also have to look really hard to not pay attention to, that it takes being trained at a young age. Whether I'm making the connection here to culture and religion because they're both hegemonic systems that work very similar. That's what you're pointing to, is that you would almost think that somebody got a hold of us all really young and just sort of got us used to seeing glaring contradictions that we learn to keep ourselves from noticing, even as we look right at them. And then once you do that, well, anybody that's told a lie and then it became obvious they were lying knows how much you want to save face and just double down. The more you go into these things that are right in your face and you don't want to fix, and now it's been 20 years and your kids are telling you, Ma, Dad, you guys jacked up, you should have done this work. Yeah, it's got to be really tempting to say, fuck you, the teacher's got a hold of you, you're a pawn.
Right.
One more, cancel culture. What is the legit? Rebecca Traister and I talked about this 6 months ago, so if you haven't heard that episode, feel free to wind it back. But what do you see is the legitimate, fact-based, evidence-based claims? This is where I'm flipping it a little bit. So I'm actually saying for the conservative base that's saying it's a terrible thing. They aren't totally full of shit. There's something to this. So where is an example of cancel culture becoming problematic? And then what does the religious ideation of this look like when suddenly the evidence isn't what people are talking about when they make accusations? This one might be easier to look at the other way because I think this one is mostly religious now too.
I definitely think it is. I mean, when we look at cancel culture and thinking even about the way that Rebecca Traister talks about it, this idea that someone is canceled it's just a use of language. It's not necessarily the reality of someone's life. Most of the people who we consider to have or should be canceled have not been canceled. Granted, Bill Cosby's in prison, Harvey Weinstein's in prison. There are people in prison for some of their acts that are canceled,
Yeah.
and will probably never work in their chosen field again. But I just so struggle with this, and what does it really mean to be canceled? And again, I think we just use it as hyperbole in that you want to cancel someone and now it's become so hyperbolic. The meaning's been lost.
Yeah.
Where, there are some people who do really, really horrible shit and they should be held accountable. But is canceling the right accountability? Even when I think about my own upbringing, my own personal indoctrination to hate, right? Which we started with religion. And I think that I've let go a lot of my anger at my religious upbringing, but sometimes I still get angry because those hateful feelings and thoughts come up. And it's frustrating for me because I don't want to feel it. But I know it's real, right? And so, which I tell my students, like, you know what? Sometimes you're going to feel shit you don't like. You need to sit through it and work through it. And so I'm trying to practice what I preach, as difficult as it is. This idea for me, and particularly as a social worker, which is the other thing going back to what I tell my students, is Maya Angelou is wonderful, but the quote, when somebody shows you who they are the first time, believe them. I really struggle with that quote because I believe people are capable of change.
I give them 2 shots. I give them an extra chance. But if they show me twice, then I tend to...
And that's kind of the idea, right? Is that people are capable of change, so they should have an opportunity to change. Some people are going to be resistant and they're not going to change. And maybe those are the people you don't try so hard with. Maybe those are the people, but there are people who are capable of change, and we should believe in that potential. Here's something that I was thinking about in this. When I think about this idea of cancel culture, I see it alive and well in the media. I see it alive and well in my social media. I've seen it alive and well in my own life when I say something.
What do you mean? You see fear of cancel culture alive and well, or you see
I think it's the fear of cancel culture. I don't think people are really being canceled.
Right.
Yeah, if somebody says something that somebody finds offensive and 1,000 people stop following it, and then it's like, well, all these people stop following me, I'm getting canceled. No, you still have a platform. You're not canceled. I mean, I even had an experience where I had posted something on my social media about toxic masculinity. And I had a person on Twitter contact my university and just go at me on
You got
Twitter.
A troll, yeah.
I did. I had a troll and that's idea that they wanted to cancel me. And honestly, I had privilege in that because I was like, my university knows what I'm teaching. They've seen my syllabus. They know this is coming up. And if they're going to, fire me over this, I knew that wasn't going to happen, right? I had this protection. I knew that despite people wanting to cancel me, I wasn't going to be canceled. And I think that's the reality for most people.
I have 9 felonies, just to remind everybody. So, I get the idea of cancel culture, but I'm with you. I tend to think this is yet another reaction to what we've talked about this. I mentioned it last week on the episode about religion as a drug. The reason Trump won was because those people that I've been talking about who spent 8 years looking at Obama and saying, well, at least all those people that keep saying I'm racist or sexist or whatever can get off my back. Look at how woke the United States is. And it turns out that instead they got attacked more and told, you have got to stop talking like that. You have got to recognize your internalized oppression. And now, with George Floyd being killed in front of all of us, the streets have flooded with protesters who seem to have gotten woke, and they're talking to their friends, and they're pissing people off. And along came Trump, who had all of these other reasons to be pissed off at the media. And these folks were pissed at the media too, because they think Modern Family is the reason it's happening. The fear of cancel culture is an example of those folks who are realizing, I used to be able to say all these words. I used to be able to talk a certain way and call women toots and smack them on the butt. And now not only am I getting those side eyes I've been getting for 10 years, but these motherfuckers are acting like I might get fired if I sexually assault a woman. Or if I keep using racist language, my kids are acting like they're not going to feel as comfortable talking to me. Or like my legacy is going to go on after I die and they're going to tell their grandkids the truth about me. That's a natural reaction if you've decided you don't want to do the work because you know you were never wrong. I mean, lo and behold, if God was telling you what to do the whole time, we're right back at the heart of religious thinking. You have no space to rethink beliefs, ideas. If you've run them by God under 50 hours, 100 hours of intimate one-on-one prayer, and you feel like you've been led by the creator of the universe who took time out of his day to tell you what to do 30 years ago, and he doubled down repeatedly through that, who are you to say, oh, I think I've been wrong all along? You've built your life such that certain areas are unassailable. We're right back where we started this episode. The simplest way to live a life would be if you could just find one answer to every question. It would be so handy. Unfortunately, that means once that question was answered, well, you don't have any other where to go. If you ever want to question the answer, you only have one source for answers, right? This is the unfortunate consequence, and this is why when we talk about religion as a wokeness, like any drug, like any religion, it works well for what it works for, but it is not all purpose. It is more than possible to take things out of context and misapply them.
And a big part of the problem, I think, with that, for people who do want to ask the questions and are willing to go to another source, there's a fear at times of asking the question because you might ask it wrong. It may be interpreted in a way you didn't intend, and then you again are the bad guy. How do we find a way to hold people accountable and allow for change to occur, right? I mean, we're seeing quite a bit people getting caught doing really bad things on camera and in different places and losing their jobs. And so the fear that there could be a backlash against your behavior is real, right? The fear that you say something stupid and you're held, I mean, those are real. But how do we allow people to recognize where that come from and do the work, right? We've talked about that a couple of times today. You either double down or you do the work. And there are people who will do the work, right? We've seen that in our lives and in our line of work. We've seen transformations in students over the time we've worked with them and been with them. And so it is real. But I realize that I'm speaking also from my own bubble of college classroom. I think that fear still exists, but we as instructors in that space try to minimize that fear so that people can ask the questions they want to ask and they can learn and they can grow. There is definitely this loud social media piece that is out here and it's informing a lot of people about a lot of things. And then there's these microcosms of that, right? Where we go into a classroom and we can have the hard conversations. And I hope that I create an environment where my students can ask some of the hard questions, right? That we can have real and honest conversations about race and about intelligence and about abortion and about all of these very kind of sticky topics, and that there's space to grow and learn in that. So it's weird to see this kind of interplay between the larger culture, this more macro culture, and the microcosm of my classroom where I don't see that as often. I don't see students being canceled for being assholes, right? I see them being held accountable and I see change happening. And how could we mimic that? Anyway, so I don't know what you think about that, or if that feels feels real.
We're right
to
back
you,
to evidence,
same,
which is that was the whole point of doing this episode. It's not to say there's nothing to wokeness. It's to say if you're somebody that is in this journey that most of us now have realized, oh, the streets were flooded, a black man was killed, and his race to some degree had something to do with it. It's not like the cop didn't see it. He saw his race, his gender. This is why you don't do drugs, kids, that was the police officer next to him saying, that's how we treat people on drugs. Those are things that are easy to see, and that's why people have gotten woke. But in that process, I think making that space has a lot to do with coming back to evidence, making sure that nobody is willing to counterattack without being able to back up what they're so mad about. That's the whole point of this conversation, is to just encourage those who know this is real. We're not making up that, oh, we've made some mistakes and there's still work to do as a country, but we have faith in this generation. We can do these things. That's a great position to be at. The reason so many people feel like they want to push back is because it does mean we're all going to have to do work. And second, they have plenty of examples popping up to go, what in the hell is that person talking about? They're out of their fucking mind. Let's just move away from that out of your mind shit and try to stick to the facts.
Well, and I'll leave you with what I usually leave my students with at the end of a semester, is that the goal of this was to engage in conversation, to start thinking about things differently. And my goal is never to make sure you leave my classroom woke, but that you're beginning to wake up. And that's really at the heart of this for me, right? Because again, saying you're woke, and I think this goes to wokeness as a religion, it means you have nowhere else to go. You have all the answers. They're right there in front of you. And we're not there. We don't have all the answers, and there's always room to learn more and to grow. And so, like I said, for my students, it's no, I just want to make sure you're waking up.
Yeah,
and
I like that.
I
That's
feel
religious.
like that resonates. It is a little religious.
No, I
and
mean
get
the
that, but
first part to say I'm woke. Yeah, that's a position that
Right.
doesn't hold water unless you're already in the the ideology.
Yeah.
So yeah, I like that, and I'll add just to that as like the frosting on this episode. If you're somebody that's struggled with this at all, you're probably not listening anyway at this point. But imagine as you're talking to your own people, and if they're struggling, especially for people that fancy themselves religious or loving or spiritual. Imagine if what we're saying is even a little bit true and poor Kenneth Copeland has got it wrong, or poor Fox News who's reporting and saying you should be scared of these critical race theory teachers. What if they had somebody tell them something that isn't quite true? Or what if they're trying to sell you something? What if there is a little bit of some truth to what we're saying and you are standing in opposition to it? It's worth at least considering that, because we're people that have good hearts. We're not over here teaching this because it's convenient. It's not. All right, Erin, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll do this again, and yeah, all right. Again, that was Dr. Erin Boyce, and I'm sure she'll be on the show again in the future. It's always fun to share a routine with the world, and Erin and I get to do this every day. Dialogue is so much more productive than debate. Love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm Ben Boyce.